The only sounds inside the chamber were the crackling of candle flames and the low rhythmic chants flowing from Chief Kalu's lips. Every man seated around the table watched Chinedu. They were studying him, waiting to see whether he would run. Mercy's muffled cries became louder. Tears streamed endlessly down her face as she struggled against the ropes until the skin around her wrists bled. Chief Kalu slowly rose from his knees and the chanting stopped. An unsettling silence settled over the room as he turned toward Chinedu and smiled.
Everything in life comes at a price. Only those bold enough to give can receive. You have been blessed abundantly by Oza, and now it's time to give back.
Chief Kalu shifted his attention to Mercy, and a cruel smile tugged the edges of his lips.
Oza demands her heart. Bring it.
Chinedu's heart stopped beating as the world around him turned dark. At this moment it felt like only he, Mercy, and Chief Kalu existed. He could feel several eyes on him, and his instincts told him there was no walking out of this. He is already eating from the forbidden tree, and now he must pay his dues. Even if he could get out of this, what was he supposed to do? Go back to his old life and watch his family beg for food? When his family was at its lowest, where was the world? Chinedu picked up the knife and walked up to Mercy. Standing over her, he watched her tremble. While the thought of taking a life terrified him, the thought of losing everything and returning back to the poverty he had just escaped scared him more. His family needs him. Mercy's muffled screams filled the room as Chinedu's shadow rose and fell violently. This display of decisiveness further painted a good impression on Chief Kalu's mind. Mercy's screams echoed through the chamber as Chinedu's shadow rose and fell beneath the trembling candlelight. None of the men looked away. They remained seated in complete silence, their expressions unchanged as though they had witnessed the same scene countless times before. When it was over, Chief Kalu stepped forward and rested a hand on Chinedu's shoulder. The old man simply looked into his eyes and smiled with quiet satisfaction.
Welcome.
That single word carried more weight than every promise Kalu had ever made. From that day onward, Chinedu's life changed in ways that had little to do with money. While the other members celebrated their newfound wealth by building larger homes, marrying more wives, and displaying their success for the village to admire, Chinedu found himself returning to Chief Kalu's mansion whenever he had free time. At first, Kalu assumed he had come seeking more wealth or influence like everyone else. Instead, Chinedu asked questions no initiate had asked before. What exactly is Oza? Why does sacrifice create prosperity? How do spirits choose who they reveal themselves to? Chief Kalu answered very little in the beginning. More often than not, he dismissed Chinedu with riddles or instructed him to observe rather than ask. Yet Chinedu kept returning. Whenever his work was finished, he would make his way to the mansion, sitting quietly beside the old man for hours, listening to stories of forgotten shrines, ancient covenants, wandering spirits, and invisible laws that governed the world beyond human sight. Unlike the others who only cared about receiving blessings, Chinedu wanted to understand where those blessings came from. It was that curiosity that separated him from every other member of the Brotherhood. Months turned into years, and Chief Kalu gradually began revealing knowledge he had never shared with anyone else. He taught Chinedu how to recognize places where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. He taught him the signs that warned of wandering spirits, the offerings that pleased some and offended others, and the ancient taboos that every spiritual practitioner learned to obey if they wished to live long. Chinedu absorbed every lesson with remarkable speed. Before long, he no longer needed Daniel to guide him through rituals or ceremonies. He understood them instinctively. As his understanding deepened, his fortunes rose alongside it. His businesses expanded beyond the village. Contracts seemed to appear wherever he looked, and every investment he touched prospered. Within only a few years, his influence had grown to rival men who had spent decades building their fortunes. The community admired his intelligence and discipline, never realizing that behind every success stood an altar stained with blood. Time quietly eroded the man he used to be. Memories of sleeping on an empty stomach, praying through the night, and listening to his father's sermons became increasingly distant. as though they belonged to someone else's life. The guilt that had nearly consumed him after Mercy's death faded with each passing year, until eventually it disappeared altogether. Sacrifice became another yearly obligation, no different from paying taxes or renewing a business license. Each time Oza demanded another life, Chinedu carried out the ritual with less hesitation than the year before, and with every sacrifice, Chief Kalu's trust in him grew stronger. Not everyone adapted as easily. Some members hesitated when the time came to fulfill their covenant. Others believed their years of loyalty had earned them mercy. They soon learned that spirits honored agreements more faithfully than men ever could. One after another, members who failed to present the yearly sacrifice died under strange and terrifying circumstances. Some wasted away despite perfect health. Others vanished without a trace, only for their mutilated bodies to be discovered weeks later in rivers or forests. A few simply lay down to sleep and never woke again. With every passing year, the seats around the ceremonial table became fewer, yet no one dared question why. Those who remained understood that the only thing more frightening than serving Oza was refusing him. Watching those men perish removed whatever fear still lingered within Chinedu. The brotherhood was no longer something he belonged to. It had become the very foundation upon which his life stood. By the third year, Chinedu's name had become synonymous with success. He owned properties across multiple cities. His businesses employed hundreds of people, and politicians sought his support during elections. To the public, he was the perfect example of a man who had risen from poverty through intelligence and relentless hard work. Only a handful of people knew the true cost of his success. It was during this period that he met Nora. Unlike everyone else, she had no interest in his wealth or reputation. She volunteered at the local church, helped organize charity outreaches, and spent most of her weekends visiting widows and orphanages. The first time they spoke, she thanked him for sponsoring the renovation of the church roof, but refused the expensive gift he later sent to her home. Their paths crossed more frequently over the following months, until friendship quietly became affection. Nora often invited him to church, and though Chinedu had little interest in the sermons, he found himself accepting simply because it gave him another excuse to spend time with her. Sitting once again beneath the same roof where his father had preached, and Pastor John now ministered, felt strangely familiar. But the words still carried little meaning. His faith had not returned. He merely occupied a seat among the congregation, while his mind remained elsewhere. Chief Kalu noticed the change almost immediately, and Chinedu sensed he had begun watching him more closely than before. 2 years passed without incident until the 5th sacrifice arrived, and Daniel's daughter was demanded. Unable to carry out the sacrifice, Daniel attempted to flee the country with his daughter, but both father and daughter died of cardiac arrest on the flight. A week later, the village gathered to mourn Daniel's tragic passing. Chinedu personally paid every expense for the funeral, purchased a new house for Daniel's aging parents, and established a monthly allowance that ensured they would never know poverty again. The entire community praised his generosity, calling him the kind of friend every man prayed to have. Only Chinedu knew he was trying to buy peace from a conscience that had grown strangely quiet. The funeral ended beneath dark clouds that refused to break. Long after the mourners had returned home, Chinedu remained standing beside Daniel's grave until the cemetery was empty. He stared at the fresh mound of earth without expression before quietly turning toward his vehicle. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering if he would do the same if he found himself in Daniel's situation. Halfway home, the heavens finally opened. Rain poured with such violence that the road ahead almost vanished beneath the downpour. Chinedu slowed his vehicle to a crawl, his headlights barely piercing the curtain of water. Then, through the rain, he saw someone standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't human. Its body was covered entirely in dried hay that swayed unnaturally despite the heavy rain. A wide bamboo hat concealed most of its head, while a wooden mask bearing 3 different faces rested where its own face should have been. It possessed no arms, only long, impossibly thin legs that moved with unnatural grace as it danced alone beneath the storm. Chinedu immediately stopped the vehicle. Every lesson Chief Kalu had taught him came rushing back. Never interrupt a wandering spirit, never call out to one or run from one, If it invites you to dance, dance. Without hesitation, Chinedu stepped out into the rain. The cold water soaked through his clothes within seconds, yet he paid it no attention. The strange spirit continued its rhythmic dance without acknowledging his presence. Slowly, Chinedu matched its movements. At first his steps were clumsy, but as the minutes passed they became smoother, almost instinctive. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the endless rainfall and the rhythm of feet striking soaked earth. Hours passed. The storm gradually weakened until only a gentle drizzle remained. The dancing spirit slowly came to a stop. For several long moments it remained perfectly still before turning one of the three faces on its mask toward Chinedu. He resisted the urge to speak immediately. Chief Kalu had taught him that spirits valued patience above all else. Only after the spirit inclined its head did Chinedu finally bow in return. Remembering another of Chief Kalu's teachings, Chinedu introduced himself, stated the name of his father, the land he came from, and the reason he had accepted the dance. The spirit listened without moving. When he finished, it slowly lifted one slender leg and stamped it once against the flooded ground. The puddle beneath them rippled unnaturally. Water rose into the air without losing its shape, circling the spirit like a living serpent before settling quietly around Chinedu's feet, as the spirit introduced itself as Miri. Unlike Oza's suffocating presence, Miri felt ancient and tranquil, like the endless flow of a river that had witnessed countless generations come and go. There was no hunger in its voice, no demand for blood, and no promise of wealth. It simply watched. That night marked the beginning of a different journey. Whenever time permitted, Chinedu returned to the rivers and forests where Mamiri chose to appear. Unlike Chief Kalu, who guarded every piece of knowledge as though it were treasure, Mamiri answered every sincere question. It taught him that the spirit world was far larger than the Brotherhood had ever revealed. Oza was only one spirit among countless others, each governed by different laws, different covenants, and different domains. The deeper Chinedu's understanding became, the more he realized Chief Kalu had never taught him everything. He had only taught him enough to remain useful. For the first time since joining the Brotherhood, Chinedu began believing that he no longer needed a master. By the 6th year, Chinedu had become one of the most influential men in the region. Chief Kalu no longer treated him as an ordinary member of the Brotherhood, but as an equal worthy of private discussions. Whenever important decisions were made, Chinedu was invited long before the other members arrived. His understanding of the spiritual world had advanced beyond anything Kalu had expected, and though the old man never admitted it, he had begun watching his protege with quiet caution. Not long afterward, Chinedu married Nora. The wedding was one of the grandest the village had ever witnessed. Politicians, businessmen, traditional rulers, and church leaders all gathered beneath the same canopy, each believing they were witnessing the union of a respectable businessman and a devoted Christian woman. Only Chief Kalu understood that Chinedu was living in two completely different worlds. A year later, Nora gave birth to a son. They named him Emmanuel. The first time Chinedu held the child in his arms, something shifted inside him. For years he had viewed sacrifice as nothing more than another obligation. But as he watched the tiny boy wrap his fingers around his own, an unfamiliar fear settled deep within his heart. For the first time since joining the Brotherhood, he understood what it meant to have someone he could never afford to lose. That single moment began changing him in ways he never expected. Although he still accompanied Nora to church from time to time, it was no longer because of her alone. He never prayed, rarely listened to the sermons, and still doubted much of what was preached. Yet he never stopped Nora from raising Emmanuel in the faith. Every Sunday he watched as she held the boy's tiny hand while walking into church, and every evening he listened as she taught him simple Bible stories before bed. Sometimes she would ask Chinedu to join them in prayer. Most nights he politely declined, but he never interrupted. Deep down, he hoped his son would grow into the kind of man he himself had failed to become. As Emmanuel grew older, Chinedu slowly began distancing himself from Chief Kalu. He resigned from the old man's company and established his own using the connections, experience, and influence he had accumulated over the years. His success hardly diminished. If anything, it continued to grow, convincing him that he no longer depended on Kalu to prosper. His meetings with Miri also became more frequent, and with every lesson the spirit revealed, Chinedu's confidence increased. He had begun believing he understood the unseen world well enough to walk his own path. Chief Kalu noticed the change immediately.
"You've become difficult to find,"
he remarked during one of their rare meetings.
"I've been busy building my own affairs."
Chinedu answered calmly. Chief Kalu studied him for several moments before nodding.
"Just remember who opened the first door."
Neither man said another word, yet both understood that something fundamental had changed between them. The relationship that had once resembled that of a teacher and his student had quietly become one of two powerful men measuring each other from opposite sides of an invisible line. Chinedu believed he had outgrown his master. Chief Kalu believed no one ever truly left the Brotherhood. Neither of them knew how soon that belief would be tested. The 9th year arrived more quickly than Chinedu expected. As always, the members of the Brotherhood gathered inside the ceremonial chamber beneath the towering golden statue of Oza. Only 9 men remained seated around the dining table. The others had all disappeared over the years, claimed either by sacrifice or by the very spirit they had once sworn themselves to. Empty chairs now occupied places that had once belonged to powerful businessmen, politicians, and wealthy merchants. No one spoke of them anymore. Within the Brotherhood, death was never mourned. It was accepted. When the ritual ended, Chief Kalu slowly opened his eyes.
"The oracle has spoken. Oza demands your mother."
The words struck Chinedu harder than anything he had heard in years. For several seconds, he simply stared at Chief Kalu, convinced he had misheard him.
"My mother?"
Chief Kalu nodded without emotion.
"Oza has chosen."
"I'll give something else."
Chinedu offered, but Chief Kalu slowly shook his head.
"You don't choose the sacrifice. Oza does."
"I'll offer 2 lives, I'll offer 10.
Still, the old man's expression never changed. For the first time since joining the Brotherhood, Chinedu left the gathering without completing the ritual. That same night, he searched desperately for Mamiri. He found the spirit standing knee-deep in the middle of a quiet river beneath the pale glow of the moon. Water flowed around its impossibly thin legs, while its 3-faced mask remained fixed upon him. Without waiting for permission, Chinedu stepped into the river.
"You have to help me. Oza wants my mother. I've done everything I was asked, I've kept every covenant, there has to be another way."
The water surrounding Mamiri began circling slowly. Then the familiar voice echoed inside Chinedu's mind.
"Life cannot be created. It can only be exchanged."
Hope returned to Chinedu's eyes.
"I'll give anything."
The river became still.
"Your sister."
The words shattered him. He stood frozen, unable to breathe. Mamiri said nothing else. It simply turned and walked deeper into the river, until both the water and the darkness swallowed it completely. Chinedu remained standing there until dawn. When he finally returned home, his mother was already awake, preparing breakfast as though nothing had happened. She smiled warmly when she saw him.
"You've been working too hard. You look tired."
She reached out and gently touched his face. Chinedu couldn't bring himself to answer. He sat beside her longer than he had in years, watching her talk about ordinary things while pretending everything was normal. For the first time since his father died, he wished he could become that young man again. That night, his mother went to bed after praying with Emmanuel, just as she always did whenever she visited. She never woke up. The doctor called it cardiac arrest. The family called it God's will. Only Chinedu knew something had come to collect its debt. Standing over his mother's grave days later broke something inside him. From that day forward, he stopped attending the yearly gatherings. He ignored every message Chief Kalu sent. Whenever members of the Brotherhood came looking for him, they were turned away at the gate. Weeks became months, yet Chinedu refused every invitation. For the first time in 9 years, he stopped serving Oza. Months passed without a single word between Chinedu and Chief Kalu. Business continued as usual. His companies expanded, Emmanuel celebrated another birthday, and life slowly settled into a fragile peace. Yet every passing month only deepened the silence between the two men. Chinedu knew Kalu wasn't the type to forgive defiance, but neither was he foolish enough to believe the old man would strike recklessly. Men like Chief Kalu always waited for the perfect moment. That moment arrived when the annual gathering came again. As the date approached, Chinedu received one message after another requesting his presence. The first was delivered respectfully. The second carried a warning. By the third, no explanation accompanied the invitation. It simply stated the date, the time, and the location. For several days, Chinedu ignored every one of them. In the evening of the gathering, he watched Emmanuel leave for church with Nora. His son waved excitedly before climbing into the car. Chinedu forced a smile and waved back. The moment the car disappeared beyond the gate, he walked inside, changed into his old ceremonial robe, and quietly left the house. He knew this confrontation had been delayed long enough. When his black SUV rolled into Chief Kalu's compound, he immediately noticed how empty it had become. Years earlier, luxury vehicles had stretched from the entrance gate to the mansion itself. Now only 6 remained. The brotherhood that had once seemed untouchable had almost disappeared. Chinedu entered the mansion without speaking to anyone. The familiar corridor felt colder than he remembered. Every portrait, every carved sculpture, every polished floor remained exactly where he had left them, yet the building felt strangely lifeless. Daniel's absence was impossible to ignore. Mercy's terrified face briefly flashed across his mind. He pushed the memory away. When he entered the ritual chamber, only 6 men sat around the massive dining table. Their hair had grayed, their faces had aged, and every one of them carried the exhausted expression of men who had spent years outrunning an inevitable debt. At the far end, Chief Kalu remained exactly as Chinedu remembered him. Without a word, he knelt before Oza's golden statue and began reciting the ancient incantations. The room gradually grew colder as the candles flickered violently despite the absence of wind.
The oracle demands your son.
What if I refuse?
Chief Kalu frowned.
No one refuses Oza.
I will be the first.
Chinedu turned without another word, picked up the sacrificial knife from the table, and walked out of the chamber. None of the remaining members dared stop him. They simply watched in silence as the heavy rain swallowed him into the night. He drove through the storm until he reached the village church. The evening service was still ongoing. Through the rain-soaked windows, he could see the congregation standing in worship. Nora's car was parked outside, exactly where he expected it to be. His eyes lingered on the building for a moment before drifting to the image of Emmanuel, waving happily at him earlier that day. The thought of that innocent boy lying on an altar where Mercy and countless others had once lain ignited something inside him. He shifted the vehicle into gear and drove away. The river welcomed him as though it had been expecting his arrival. Standing knee-deep in the water was Miri, its towering figure almost invisible beneath the curtain of rain. The 3-faced mask stared silently at him, while the river flowed peacefully around its thin legs. Unlike the last time they met, Chinedu showed no hesitation. He stepped into the river until the water reached his waist, drew the ritual knife across his palm, and allowed his blood to drip into the current. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the heavens as Chinedu raised his bleeding hand and made an offering that even Miri could not refuse. The spirit remained motionless throughout, but the river around them began to churn violently, as though acknowledging the covenant that had just been made. When midnight arrived, something awakened. A ghastly figure drifted silently across the sleeping village, floating above rooftops and empty streets before arriving outside Chinedu's home. Without slowing down, it passed through the walls and entered Emmanuel's bedroom. The little boy slept peacefully beneath his blanket, unaware of the death that crept toward him. The spirit reached out. Before it could touch the child, another hand seized it. The creature let out a horrifying screech as it was violently dragged backward through the darkness. Its final sight was Chinedu standing at the foot of Emmanuel's bed, his face covered with white chalk markings, while Miri's enormous shadow towered silently behind him like an ancient guardian. The spirit struggled desperately, but within moments both it and Mimiri vanished into the darkness. Miles away inside the golden shrine, Chief Kalu staggered backward, his eyes widening in disbelief. Through his bond with Oza, he had witnessed the final moments of the messenger he had sent. His breathing became uneven as he immediately began chanting incantations beneath his breath. Grabbing his carved staff, he raised it toward the ceiling. Crimson lightning wrapped itself around the wood before exploding outward. The staff shot through the roof like a spear of living fire, racing through the storm toward Chinedu's home. At that same moment, Chinedu stepped outside barefoot, dressed only in his nightclothes. He left his vehicle untouched. Standing beside Miri, he began dancing. His movements perfectly mirrored those of the spirit. Together, they danced through the rain-soaked streets without speaking a single word. As their feet struck the flooded earth, the storm intensified. Thunder rolled endlessly above them until a blinding bolt of lightning crashed into the flying staff, shattering its power and hurling it from the sky. The same bolt continued into the distance. Moments later, Chief Kalu's shrine erupted into flames. The explosion threw the old man backward as fire consumed the wooden carvings surrounding Oza's altar. He stared at the inferno in stunned silence, unable to understand what had just happened. He wasn't the only one. Across the village, every surviving member of the fraternity suddenly heard the same terrifying cry echo through the night. Drawn by a force they couldn't resist, each man stepped outside his home. Before any of them could react, lightning descended from the heavens one after another, striking them where they stood. Their screams were swallowed by the storm, as the covenant they had lived by for years demanded its final payment. While chaos unfolded around the village, Chinedu never stopped dancing. The rain followed every step he and Miri took as they crossed deserted streets toward Chief Kalu's mansion. A handful of frightened villagers peered through their windows and recorded the impossible sight of a man dancing beside an invisible force beneath a sky, alive with lightning. When Chinedu finally arrived, he found the mansion gates locked for the first time since he had known Chief Kalu. A violent gust of wind tore them from their hinges. Without slowing his pace, Chinedu entered the compound and walked through the burning mansion until he reached the familiar ceremonial chamber. Chief Kalu stood alone. Gone was the confident man who had ruled the Brotherhood for decades. Standing in the corner of the room, he stared at Chinedu with undisguised fear.
What did you do?
Chinedu slowly raised the blood-stained ritual knife.
You taught me that life is about sacrifice and that the victor is the one willing to give the most. So I offered my life, for yours, and for every member of this fraternity. This evil ends with me.
Chief Kalu's composure finally broke.
Wait, there is no need to go this far. We can still talk.
Chinedu answered with silence. He charged forward. Chief Kalu's screams echoed through the chamber as the ritual knife rose and fell again and again, just as it had on the night Mercy died. The same blade that had been prepared for Emmanuel finally fulfilled its purpose. Not by claiming an innocent life, but by ending the man who had demanded so many. When it was over, the room became silent once more. Chinedu walked to the head of the table where Chief Kalu had always sat, and lowered himself into the chair. Looking around the empty chamber, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the young man who once believed God would answer every prayer. He remembered Mercy, Daniel, his mother, every sacrifice, every compromise, every decision that had slowly transformed him into someone his younger self would never have recognized. 10 years. That was all it had taken. He had allowed tragedy to dictate every decision he made, and a life built upon tragedy could only end in tragedy. Every sacrifice had solved yesterday's problem while creating tomorrow's. He had made his bed. Now he would lie in it. Behind him, Mamiri's shadow slowly expanded until it swallowed the walls of the chamber. Chinedu understood the covenant had reached its end. Closing his eyes, he did something he had not done in 10 years. He prayed, not for forgiveness or for another chance, only that Emmanuel would never walk the path his father had chosen.